Good afternoon, everyone, and morning or evening for those joining us online. I am Silvia Mantilla, Global Policy Manager at the World Federation for Animals, and I'll be guiding us through the launch today of the Scientific Consensus on Wildlife and Climate. I remember when I first learned about how wild animals actively shape the carbon cycle, how they help ecosystems sequester and store carbon, that ecosystems aren't abstract. Remove those animals and those services collapse. I remember the hope I felt, knowing these allies were there, ready to help in our climate action. Today, we can share that hope with anyone interested in addressing the climate crisis. Because for the first time, scientists from around the world have come together to collectively emphasize the vital role wild animals play in climate change mitigation and adaptation, and to call on governments to account for them in climate policy. Two of the scientists are here with us today, Dr. Tricia Atwood of Utah State University and Nathan Roberts of Northeast Forestry University in China. The science is clear on how dire the climate crisis is, but the science is also clear on what we can do. Wild animals like elephants, tapirs, sharks, tigers, they actively shape the carbon cycle. Protecting them and enabling them to thrive is an actionable solution. Jane Goodall, in one of her last books, described hope as something that we create through action. And that is what this consensus does. It gives us evidence. It gives us a foundation to act on. And that, today, is a message of hope. Today, Nathan and Tricia will walk us through the science, and they'll be followed by Matt Collis from the International Fund for Animal Welfare, who will speak on what this means for climate policy. So with that, let's start. Nathan?
Perfect, thanks very much. So the statement was very carefully put together through a systematic process, working together with colleagues who work across different species groups, across different ecosystems, across different geographic regions, and across disciplines. And what it really identified was commonalities, as well as the breadth of the effects of animals on different ecosystems. And this was across systems and across disciplines. So for animals, what this really means is we have some understanding about insect and other invertebrates, reptiles, mammals, birds, and fish. And for ecosystems, this means there's research in terrestrial land environments, also in rivers, freshwater, and the marine ecosystems too. This is coastal and open ocean processes. But the system also openly acknowledges context dependency, because animal effects can vary in kind of their magnitude or even sometimes the direction of how they impact ecosystems. And so when we sort of take a look at how these animal effects actually work, we can start with the very simple food web, because even a 5-year-old understands food webs. It's very, very simple ecology, simple science. Because we know plants, when we talk about climate change, plants get the big attention. Because plants are the big carbon store. They're also the major powerhouse for removing carbon from the atmosphere. So it seems sort of logical to think that the herbivores which eat plants, surely they would impact carbon stock or impact the carbon cycle. Seems pretty obvious. And as many gardeners or foresters and farmers know, some sort of thinning or pruning. We know this. People in the room know this. You do some gardening and it can promote further growth. And so we know this with animal systems too. A certain number of herbivores in the system are doing the same thing. They can thin those plants. They can reduce plant density, but ultimately they can increase the plant biomass. But of course, there is this Goldilocks moment, of course. If there's too much grazing or too much browsing, of course, wipeout. It's a disaster. So we need to think about how we balance this. And thankfully in nature, herbivores are not the top level in the system. we have large carnivores. Large carnivores play this critical role in balancing the ecosystem, balancing the large herbivore numbers and having cascading effects on vegetation and plant communities. And really, this idea of thinking about carnivores is about intact ecosystems. It's not sufficient to just think about herbivores, because what we need to recover and restore is large, intact ecosystems with full trophic diversity. And so another area that was identified in the consensus is about waste and movement. Because animals, they have many natural behaviors. And so as they eat and they move and they excrete waste in the environment, of course what they're doing is actually redistributing or recycling nutrients. And that can promote plant growth because, of course, it improves improves the soil health and fertility. So that will have effect on plant productivity. And if we take a slightly different view, it's about carbon, promoting carbon capture. And across the consensus, the sort of key message is that animals are not just passive parts of the ecosystem. They're active drivers, driving ecological processes which are relevant to climate change. And so we can take an example. The first example we'd like to share today with everyone is about tigers. About tigers, here's a beautiful tiger. The tigers, this is in a nice snowy region in Northeast Asia, the Amur tiger. And so we can talk about tigers and the forest ecosystem and the carbon storage. And as we know, we're familiar with tigers. Tigers sit at the top of the food chain. And they're generally assumed to be a sort of indicator of ecosystem health. Because how can you have tigers if the rest of the ecosystem doesn't exist so well? So there needs to be sufficient prey and sufficient plant resource to support those prey. And tigers, they've had a challenging past. They now live in about 10% or less than 10% of their distribution. But also their population size has gone from about 100,000 down to just 4,000 or 5,000. So what I've been working on over the past few years is about how the tiger population is linked with forest carbon stocks. Because we know carbon management is incredibly important for mitigating climate change. And we also need to think about how the loss of a species or also the recovery of a species might affect carbon cycle. And there's 3 points I'd like to share just now. The first is about indicators. Because forests with tigers have got more vegetation carbon than forests without tigers. And this is consistent across habitat types and across regions. But in terms of tiger density, also, if we were to plot this on a nice graph, tiger density, carbon stock, nice positive relationship. You might also have this kind of threshold, as we have for herbivores and those plant communities. But what we really need to know is it tigers that are driving this? So this is what I did next. I looked at tiger and carbon situation across the species range. This includes China, Russia, India, Nepal, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on. Of course, carbon is quite different between the tropics and temperate regions. And there's two distinct groups. There's forests with low carbon and high carbon. This is where it gets interesting. Because in the low carbon forest, this is where tigers can have a strong effect. In the low carbon forest, the prey populations are lower. Easier for a tiger to control the prey, and the prey control the plants. Nice and simple. But in the high carbon forest, doesn't really work this way. And this is a really important part of the context dependency, which we highlight in the consensus. And so finally, there's one point I'd like to make about guardians. Tigers as guardians of forest carbon stocks. Because, forests with tigers, forests without tigers, probably they both have some sort of carbon emissions. But in a very simple counterfactual, we can see that the forest with tigers, if it didn't have tigers, emissions would be higher. A nice simple number, if you like, 9%. Emissions would be about 9% higher if we lost tigers, and carbon removals would be lower, about 28% lower. And just to very quickly put in a final comment from our colleagues who work across the species range, many of you may be familiar that tigers were lost from Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos in the last few years, locally extinct. What happened? After we lost the tigers, habitat forest loss increased by about 400%. So, tigers are guardians of forests, And this is something that we are promoting, and just saying that Protect Tigers actually is helping us to reduce emissions from deforestation and degradation. So now with that, I'd like to pass on to Tricia for a very different example.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. So I'd like to take you half a world away and under the water to give you another example of how animals can influence carbon storage in this time, a seascape. So my examples come from research in Shark Bay, Western Australia, as well as the Great Barrier Reef. In both of these places, sharks act as top predators, much like tigers do in Asian forests. But they don't just influence their ecosystems based off of eating other animals. They influence their ecosystems by changing the behavior of their prey. For example, in Shark Bay, tiger sharks influence both sea turtles and dugongs and where they forage. Much like many people, our dugongs and sea turtles are also afraid of sharks, and they will choose to forage in places that provide a lower risk of an attack. In Shark Bay, this place is known as having it used to have a very developed seagrass meadow. And seagrass is really important for carbon storage. It's one of our biggest carbon stores in the ocean. So our sea turtles and our dugongs know the places in the ocean where the risk of predation is lower. And as a result, they will forage more heavily in those locations, reducing and changing seagrass species. In the other areas where predation risk is higher, we see that the seagrass forest is more lush, has different types of species that store more carbon. We actually see a very similar thing in the Great Barrier Reef, again with sharks and other large predatory fishes. They, this time, influence herbivorous fish that feed on algal habitats surrounding coral reefs. These fishes often concentrate their feeding close to the safety of the reef, which provides them refuge, and reduce their use of areas further away from the reef where the chance of a predation event could occur. Again, this creates these distinct areas where grazing pressure can be quite high, which is close to the reef, and other areas where predation or where herbivory is very low and allows the algae to grow. In both of these systems, sharks help determine where herbivores feed and where the plants and algae grow. By influencing these patterns of grazing, these predators can affect the distribution of primary productivity on the seafloor and ultimately how carbon is stored across these seascapes, particularly in the sediments, which act as long-term carbon stores that can lock away carbon for tens of thousands of years. Importantly, sea turtles, dugongs, and herbivorous fish are not the problem. They are native species performing their natural ecological functions. They actually help promote growth of the seagrass, and they help distribute the seeds. The problem is that we have reduced shark densities significantly throughout the world. We have also reduced the habitat of seagrass through many ecological changes, including climate change, forcing our herbivores to graze in ways that they have never grazed before, and concentrating their grazing in certain places. And this can have detrimental effects to how carbon is stored across these seascapes. This example illustrates a broad message from the consensus that animals can influence climate-relevant outcomes, not only through their abundance, but also through their behavior and interactions with other species. By shaping where animals feed, move, and spend their time, predators can influence carbon storage, among other things. The other things that they can influence is how ecosystems can withstand perturbations, particularly climate change. These same animals can influence ecosystem stability and resilience. When ecosystems are intact, and when all of those interactions among species remain intact, we know that ecosystems can often better withstand disturbance and continue functioning. And that's very important because climate change is increasing the frequency of droughts, floods, storms, and other environmental stressors. There is also a growing scientific consensus that wildlife often contributes to this resilience by helping maintain the ecological interactions and processes that support these healthy systems. Overall, our consensus is not arguing that wildlife is the silver bullet that will solve climate change. They cannot. We know that rapid reductions in greenhouse gas emissions remain essential, and that no ecological processes that we know so far can substitute for that. Rather, this message is that ecosystems are not simply collections of plants, animals, and soil. They are living networks of interactions, and animals are an important component of that. We know that animals are an important piece of the puzzle, and that by leaving them out, we don't just make the picture simpler, we make our understanding of it less complete. We now need to include animals and wildlife into our knowledge of climate, into our models, and into our policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Tricia, and thank you, Nathan, for taking us through some of the key elements that are captured in the consensus and some case studies that help illustrate those points really vividly for us. And just to underline, really, those are two quick case studies of the many that the authors of the consensus statement looked at. And as Nathan alluded to, from the tropics to polar regions in terms of ecosystems, and from elephants, tapirs, and toucans in forests to sharks, whales, and fish in the ocean. These are animals performing these tasks in ecosystems all over the planet. And it's something that's being overlooked so far, largely overlooked so far in policy frameworks, which I wanted to touch on a little bit. I think Nathan really captured the point well when he mentioned about the fact that these animals are not passive participants in these ecosystems. These ecosystems are not static places. We hear talk particularly in climate discourse around forests or around oceans as if these places exist simply in location rather than them being the dynamic processes that ecosystems are. And wild animals play a disproportionate role in that and have a disproportionate impact. And that's something that the consensus statement really seeks to highlight, that these are not just passive participants, but active drivers of ecosystem function and services, including climate mitigation and resilience. And I think that's the key point that we want to see now reflected in policy. Start viewing wildlife and wild animals not just as victims of the climate crisis, which they are, but also as crucial allies in our ability to respond to the climate crisis through nature and natural climate solutions. I think Trish captured it particularly well with that last comment about the missing puzzle piece, because in our search perhaps for simplicity, we've created a system that's actually incomplete. And that, I think, is very true for the policy frameworks we have in front of us. And so there is a real opportunity now to start to look at that in policy discourse. And I want to pay credit to the government of Zimbabwe and fellow African nations who have taken up the mantle on this issue and have pushed forward the idea of a declaration, a political declaration around the role of wildlife in climate action. And I think that presents a real opportunity for parties at the UNFCCC to think about this issue in more detail. But it's not just at that broader political level, but also on a country-by-country basis, looking at where those key species are in each jurisdiction, where those key ecosystems are, and the role that wildlife conservation and protection can play in incorporating that into climate plans and nationally determined contributions. And we've seen recent examples of that. There was research that came out just last month about the role of dugongs and seagrass ecosystems in Bahrain and how they can more than double the amount of carbon captured and stored in those ecosystems where dugongs are present. And Bahrain has actually captured that in its NDC as an area of research that it wants to continue to look at and build into. And IFAW have produced guidelines that parties can use to help them build these issues into their NDCs, from the very simple process of recognizing that role and looking at which species feature in their jurisdictions, to how you build ambition to account for the carbon within those NDCs and to look at projects that will protect and conserve those species. So there are real opportunities here for the policy framework, and we really hope that the declaration serves as a springboard for that work to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think a round of applause is very welcome. Thank you so much, Matt, Trisha, Nathan. Obviously we work together, and every time I can just watch you talk about this. I think we now have some time for questions from the audience. Please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll make sure that we bring a microphone. Yes? Is there a microphone somebody can help me with? 1 second.
Hi everyone, I'm Pranita. I'm a wildlife conservation scientist from India. I work at the intersectional welfare and mitigating conflict and community resilience embedded into it. So my question is, as professionals working within the wildlife sector, within the conservation sector, we know how important they are to mitigating climate change, and how everything from migration to conflict between humans and wildlife is also influenced by climate change. But when we come here and we are in the UNFCCC process, we are in climate negotiations, it is not really considered. So given all the data that we have, how do you think there can be a meaningful integration and not just have a separate conference or separate negotiations for biodiversity itself, but how do we really bring the biodiversity dialogue into mainstream dialogue in a way that it's not separate, because they're all interlinked, from One Health to diseases to community resilience. But we're still here just talking about, in climate negotiations, just carbon and fossil fuels when everything is integrated. So yeah, that's my question.
Thank you so much. Maybe we'll check if there's another question, and otherwise. Matt?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that. You're right. There's for those of us who work across these different conventions, the links feel obvious, and there's real opportunities for more policy coherence between the work that goes on. The approaches, of course, are different. The focuses are different, and naturally people are very focused on carbon and indeed on human impacts of climate change at this convention. But I guess for us, at least, one of the rationale for as a wildlife organisation engaging in this work is to make the point that actually that they can be allies in this process, to things that affect us and as humans and our planet more generally, and making that more livable. And that doesn't mean that there aren't complex issues to navigate, including how humans and wildlife share space. But it points to me is that there's a real opportunity, and in many respects at the UNFCCC, it's behind the curve on this, because many of the other conventions, particularly biodiversity-focused ones, have already started looking at this role that wildlife play in climate change. We've seen that in CBD decisions at the last COP, the Convention on Migratory Species, the International Whaling Commission, the IUCN and its recent Congress have all looked at this issue and highlighted how important it is. And so I think there's a real opportunity for us to play catch-up here at the UNFCCC and to start to highlight that process.
Maybe I can add. Just on a practical side, in terms of the human-wildlife conflict, obviously I work with tigers. So as a top predator, if we're recovering the population of tigers, which is a great win for biodiversity and conservation ecologically, it then enters into the social realm of how do we manage this. And there's ways and means, of course. So we can think about kind of zoning, or how do we manage our land. This is not specifically my area of expertise of, we're going to design like this, but the basic principles are very simple. Of, okay, this area, let's make it our core wildlife area, and everything can happen there. But around maybe human settlement areas, okay, we need to manage wildlife slightly differently, or think about human safety first. And so we kind of take an approach of maybe, okay, this is how we manage for wildlife, this is how we manage for forest carbon or vegetation carbon, and so you can integrate all these things into this kind of landscape plan, and I think that's how it could work on a more local scale. But yeah, great point, thanks so much.
Yes, I think we have another question. The microphone, please.
My name is James Lloyd. I'm from Nature for Climate Coalition, and it's great seeing you bringing this increasing evidence through as a group, and I think it's a really important area, especially in the next few months as we go towards the GST2. I think it's another opportunity to submit more evidence into the technical submission. What I think is important to think about is where the hook is on this. And I think there's, with the 2030 forest target, as we get closer into GST, I think it's not only important that we defend that target, but we also enhance it. And I think certainly on a terrestrial level, where I know most about, and you might prove me wrong on the ocean side, I think there's increasing debate around old growth forest and primary habitats and strengthening the protections of certain very specific areas in the deforestation target that we know absolutely are critical, that they're protected, and working with the communities that live within them in a way that's important. And I think this brings more evidence to that there's some areas of, certainly forest where I know best, but drylands, wetlands, other areas, which are so critical both for the carbon potential, but also have synergies across Rio Conventions and other areas, where I think this increasingly makes that case. And I think having some of those site specifics with this data and actually working with the people that are working on the 2030 forest target or around protection of old growth forest or primary habitats, I think is a really important alliance to build, and then think about landing that into the GST too. And hopefully some of the parties that are supporting you on this would be proactive in that, and rather than seeing it as a threat to their sovereignty or their decision making.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I agree.
just maybe one brief thought in response to that. I mean, I think it's a very good point and very well made, and in some respects reflects the comment Trish made about the kind of missing piece of the puzzle. Forestry is a really good example where we've gone from we need more trees to thinking we need more native trees to we need more intact forests, we need proper not defonated forests, to the point now where we're saying actually there's an additional piece in this that we're missing, because we could restore those forests, but if we don't restore the wildlife in them that does the seed dispersal and other tasks, we know there's good evidence around seed dispersing seeds of large mature trees that store more carbon. We've seen that with forest elephants, tapirs, I think other fruit-eating birds. So there's really good examples across multiple forest systems of the role that wild animals play in that. And I think to me it's that natural progression of the sophistication of how we approach these issues in the UNFCCC and in the climate discourse.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for that. And I think we can definitely catch up after this. I'm going to use the last couple of minutes to plug in two very important points. One is everything that we have shared today, including the full list of signatories, which as of now is nearly 300 scientists from around the world. You can find at this website. I encourage you to take a photo and explore the site, where we have a really beautiful, if I must say, and growing evidence platform with all the stories behind all these animals who are our allies in climate action. So you can learn more about how the sea otters help us, the sharks, the tigers, and many, many others. I encourage you to explore the scientific wildlife and climate consensus.org. And if you're still around by the very, very end of these bond negotiations on the 18th of June in the afternoon, we will be having a side event where we will have Tricia, Nathan, and government representatives having an actual discussion on how we can plug this in more in climate policy. So I really encourage you, everyone. The room is Bonn at 4:30 p.m. next Friday. Anyway, thank you so much, everyone.